When you see thousands of boats every year, you see some interesting issues and problems that you normally wouldn't see, or even think about ever being an issue when it comes to your boat. So here are 6 issues that we think are pretty interesting. Or like our first issue here, are something that are super simple but somehow got overlooked. Here we've got a pretty simple toilet where we have a couple of things going on. The main complaint here is that there isn't any water coming out into the toilet when you try and flush it. Which turns out down here in this compartment is the shutoff valve, where we've got the marine head inlet seacock and the holding tank discharge seacock too. Turns out they weren't pulling the valve open to allow the water to get to the toilet pump. But this isn't the only issue, just something simple that if you've never used a toilet on a boat, you just don't think about. Opening and shutting the valve to let the water in. This is a common setup here where we've got a long rod and a handle that attaches to the valve so that you can pull up or push down on the rod to open or close the valve. This way you don't have an open valve on the boat when it doesn't need to be open. But then once the water would come up here to the head pump, the hose going over from the pump to the toilet has a straight up 90-degree bend in it, kinking the hose and completely shutting it off. You'd think that you would notice this when you put the hose in. You can imagine if you were the one putting this in looking at the hose when you're done and thinking to yourself, yep, now that's a fine job there, it's perfect. Moving on to the next issue though, we've got a really interesting break in a lower unit here, where there isn't any damage to the skeg, the propeller, they didn't hit anything, and there wasn't any water in the gear case. But we've got this crack that goes all the way around the lower unit right where the forward bearing race is. It's a perfect crack all the way around too. Super interesting when it comes to just a straight up break that wasn't caused by anything. No, it's just a gear case splitting in half. Another interesting issue is what we've got on this Optimax here. If you haven't seen our video on outboard's #1 problem, then we encourage you to watch that after this video, because we discuss different fuel issues in that video, which is what we have going on here with this Opti, where the engine was running out of fuel randomly, causing all kinds of issues, as well as just poorly running when it wasn't completely running out of fuel. So after pulling the vapor separator tank and getting that apart, in here we found some interesting issues going on with the float switch and the needle valve.
Man, that is not good.
Now for those of you that aren't familiar with this kind of a system, what this does is basically regulates how much fuel is allowed to get into the tank from the fuel tank in the boat. So whenever the VST fills up with fuel, it will push this float up, which will shut the little needle that is attached to the float, shutting off the fuel supply into the vapor separator tank. Seeing that this float was stuck in the up position, shutting off the fuel supply, we pulled this float off and found that the tip of the needle was all misshaped and funny looking. So we replaced that needle, which is a pretty common thing to do, but then the float was still sticking up, shutting everything off, which is when I noticed another really interesting problem with the float, where the little slot in the top of the float where the stop on the top of the VST is supposed to slide into in order to stop the float from going up any further was getting caught on the float, sticking it in the up position. It looks like the float has warped a little bit over time and just enough for it to get lodged in that little lip on the top of the float, causing it to stick. The float and everything else are still operating properly, and with the availability of stuff right now, I just took a utility knife and cut a little sliver of the float off so that it wouldn't get stuck on that knob or the stop of the VST anymore, resolving the issue of the float sticking in the VST. Now for the next issue, this one is another problem that we have covered in a previous Technicians Tuesday, which is why you should take the time to make sure that you are subscribed to the channel, but the issue is one of having an air leak, or some aeration in the fuel supply coming from the boat's fuel tank. This can be caused by all kinds of issues: a rusted fuel filter, a hole in the fuel lines, a broken clamp on one of the fuel lines. But what the end result of this issue can look like can vary greatly depending on the air leak in the system. For this instance here, the leak was so small that it would run fine all the time when you're running in mid-range or wide open throttle, but then when you brought the engine down to an idle for too long, it was small enough to allow air into the system to where the engine wouldn't run out of fuel, but would just run so bad it would violently shake because of how lean it was running. Now moving on to another interesting issue is the issue of what happens when the fuel vent gets clogged. Whenever the vent gets clogged on a boat's fuel tank system, it will cause you to have to fill up the boat so slowly in order to not spit fuel back up out of the tank, shutting the nozzle off. You can also find along those lines and that train of thought though, that on a brand new fuel tank and system, it will have the same effect on the first fill up. The first time that the boat gets filled up, when it has a carbon canister or evaporation controlled components in the vent system, you can find that it takes a long time to get the tank filled up, but once it is, you never seem to have the issue again. I'm not really sure why that is, which is why it's made the list of interesting issues that you can find with a boat. Now the last issue that we want to talk about is something that can destroy your engine and ruin your trip, which is why you should know that this is actually a thing, and it does happen. To put the scenario into context, it's important to think about where boats are in today's world, meaning that most boats are running around with higher horsepower engines, anywhere from 200 to 450 horsepower on a single engine, and many times being powered with multiple engines. There are many offshore boats that are anywhere from 4 to 5 to 12,000 pounds in weight, and they can usually run anywhere from 45 to 65 miles an hour, which is how this event can happen. So say we're out on our 6,000 pound boat with a couple hundred horsepower worth of engines running around 50 miles an hour across the water. Next thing you know, you're coming up on a buoy, something floating, a weed line, a huge wave, or something flies out of the boat. The immediate reaction of most people, especially when something goes flying out of the boat, like someone's hat, is to reach down and grab the control handles and bring them back quickly, which isn't terrible, not the best way to come off plane, but usually not a bad thing. Then instead of hitting the forward detent on the control box or the neutral position, during the panic they throw the engine all the way down into reverse, which will usually stall the engine, if not blow out the gear case. Now the boat's gone from turning 5,000 RPM and doing 50 to being in reverse without the engine running, which is a massive issue, because the boat has got that forward momentum but is coming off plane, which will bring a huge wake up onto the back of the engine, but with enough forward momentum for the water to turn the prop that's in reverse, which will spin the lower unit, spinning the engine over. And this is when the unfortunate event happens where the engine sucks in water through the exhaust and actually hydrolocks the engine. Because of the weight, speed, and size of the propeller though, it's enough to do serious damage to the inside of the engine, bending valve stems, piston rods, and simply destroying the engine. Making the moral of the story in this case to be paying attention when you are driving the boat, and be conscious enough at all times to never panic and throttle. Or in this case, chop the throttle back into reverse from wide open throttle, throwing everyone in the boat forward, and potentially blowing up your engine. No, the only time that you should panic and throttle is whenever you are docking your boat or pulling it up on the trailer with an audience of people or a crowd with cameras. And in that scenario there, it is absolutely standard procedure to all out panic and slam the throttle to wide open. Now we want to thank everyone for hanging out with us this week. If you aren't already, subscribe to the channel and visit us at bornagainboating.com, where we've got tons of great informational boating content. Have a great rest of the week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.